Hello, a few days ago, the 23rd of November, was Wolfenoot, a imaginative festival celebrating wolves, and it had been my intention to do a live link and tell some wolf stories, but I'm afraid my knowledge of technology is so limited it just didn't work out and happen the way I wanted it to, and life got in the way as well. And as you can tell from the throat, I'm also suffering the after effects of several days of coughing and sneezing and spluttering. So I'm recording some stories, well, two stories and a poem now, that would have been done as a fundraiser for Wolfenoot, the money going to the Dogs Trust. I can't work out the technology, it gives me a headache to set up the fundraising page. So if you like these two stories and the poem, then please donate however much you want to donate to the Dogs Trust, and at least they'll get the money that way, even if I'm too crap and disorganised to set up the tech side of the fundraising page. So we will begin with the tale of Ivan of Shiganska. In deepest, coldest Russia, 100 more years ago, there lived a woodcutter, as there always is, Ivan, in the village of Shiganska, on the banks of one of the great rivers that cut across Russia. He lived with his mother and his two sisters, and it was a somewhat lonely life. So, although he had a mother and two sisters and various neighbours, there was no woman in his life, and you can have nice conversations with your mother and your sisters and your neighbours, and you can pass an evening and share the vodka, and life has its pleasures, but there are certain pleasures which you do not get if you do not have a wife in your life. And he yearned for someone. And it was on one morning when he was out with his dog, hunting in the woods, for the dog was a good hunter, that he had a most peculiar encounter, a tragic encounter, for there was a great howling and a snarling in the woods off, and the dog bolted towards the sound. And at first Ivan thought it is maybe it sounded like a wolf. It could have been a beast in the forest. It certainly didn't sound like a deer or anything that they might want to hunt, rabbits or whatever. It was snarling and growling, and the dog raced towards it, and there was barking and yapping and yipping, and then suddenly a great cry of pain, a howl of pain, and Ivan ran as fast as he could through the snows and burst through the cover of trees onto where he could hear the dog yelping on the other side, and there in the snow lay the poor dog, his beloved dog who had been a companion to him for many, many, many years. Laying there, his throat torn, his belly torn, blood everywhere, and great paw prints in the snow. The owner of those great paw prints, too big to be the paw prints of the poor dog itself, had gone, disappeared off into the snows, leaving a splattered trail of blood in the white snows behind. Oh, Ivan grieved, his heart was heavy, for he had loved that dog. It had been his favourite dog for all the years of his life, and now the poor little thing was gone. Even if there'd been anyone in the village with veterinary knowledge, Ivan could see that the injuries to the dog were so severe that there was no hope for the poor little beast. And as he cradled it in his arms and carried it back, the poor dog died. And they didn't even get to the village itself before the poor dog died. His life expired in his arms, and Ivan sat on a fallen log, and the tears froze on his face. It was so cold. When he heard a crunching sound behind him, footsteps in the snow, and panicking, the wolf or whatever it was that had attacked his dog, maybe a bear, who knows, had come back for finishing off the meat of the dog and perhaps eat him as well in the process. He spun round, holding the dog in one arm and fumbling for his gun with the other hand. When he stopped and realised he did not need his gun, for before him, dressed in elegant white furs to keep her warm in the snows, was a rather beautiful woman. Not a woman of the village. He knew all of the women in the village, he knew all of the men in the village, they were all well known to him. She was a stranger, and strangers were very unusual in Shiganska, very seldom seen. When they arrived, they had normally arrived in a carriage by the road, not just walking through the woods, dressed in furs. And so Ivan introduced himself and asked her if she was lost, had she some accident befallen her, and the woman said her name was Breda, and that she was journeying from her village, where she had buried her husband. His funeral had been the day before, and she, having nothing else for her in the village, just grief and sorrow, was journeying to find a new life. And when Ivan pointed out that she looked awfully cold and was shivering and shaking, she agreed, this Breda, that it was indeed fierce, harsh weather, and she'd been walking on many, many, many miles through the snow to find a new life. And did he, this handsome stranger that she had encountered in the woods, did he know of where she might find a new life? And so Ivan, no fool, so he thought, invited her in. He said, "You must come to my house, you must meet my mother, meet my sisters, you must eat." He showed her the dog, and she said, "Oh, how sad, how awful." And he said, I must bury my poor dog, but whilst I am doing that, you can at least be warm in our humble abode, and have something to eat and something to drink and sit by the fire, for you are turning blue. I can see you are so cold." And so, with both the great sadness of the death of his dog, but also this unexpected flutter of, well, maybe it was too early to call it lust, but romantic interest to be in the company of a mysterious and beautiful woman, blended together in Ivan's heart. And it was difficult for him to sustain a normal conversation with this beautiful woman, both because he was grieving for the dog in his arms, but also because he was quite inexperienced in the ways of love. There were, well, some single women in the village, but they were all betrothed to better looking and higher earning men than poor Ivan. And so he had never really had much experience of trying to woo and charm a woman. So he never really quite knew what to say to her, but between them they managed to fill the awkward silences. On the journey back to the house, and Ivan took her inside and introduced her to his mother and to his sisters, and they were at once intrigued and not a little hostile when they saw the flushed look upon Ivan's face, and they too were shocked with grief at the death of the dog, for whilst they did not care for the dog quite as much as Ivan cared for the dog, nonetheless it had been a family beast for many a long years, a pet of sorts to them, or it was a working animal. And they were horrified by the death of the dog and the way it had died, and the story that there were perhaps wolves or bears or some other dangerous animal coming close to the village. But they also had the mystery of this woman and the concern about the way she was looking at Ivan and the way Ivan was looking at her. And whilst Ivan was off digging a grave in the hard soil for the poor dog, the women of the house got to know each other and prepared food and prepared drink and stoked up the fire and asked a few tentative questions, and the woman Breda told her story of her dead husband and how she had buried him but a day or so beforehand, and how she had nothing else for her in the village. She had no relatives in that village, no in-laws in that village, no nothing in that village beyond her husband, and now he was gone. And they listened to this tale, and it seemed terribly sad. Not an uncommon sort of a story to hear in the world in that day, but they listened and they made all the appropriate noises. And they could see she was warming up by the fire. They could see she was benefiting from having hot stew in her stomach and a glass or three of vodka to wash it down with. And, well, it was a small village. There was no hotel, there was no bed and breakfast or Airbnb or anything of that sort. And the next village on was a good 3 days' walk for someone who was fit and healthy, let alone some poor woman who had been staggering through snow-laden forests for at least a day or two, or possibly longer, because it became apparent that Breda's grip upon the passage of time, perhaps as a result of all of the cold temperatures she'd been walking through, was a little bit confused. And sometimes she said her husband had died a day before, and sometimes he'd died 2 days before, and sometimes she said a week before, and she'd been walking and walking and walking, and she clearly didn't quite grasp whether she'd been walking for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days. It was all beginning to blur and merge. But cold will do that to you, hunger will do that to you. And so, with very little ado, Ivan said, well, why didn't she stay with them? At least until she had decided where she wanted to go and what she wanted to do in the long time. And his mother and his sisters were a little put out at this notion. They had no spare bedrooms. But Ivan said she could stay in his room, but very quickly reassured his mother and his sisters that he could sleep on the hearthrug by the fire. Was this beautiful and mysterious Breda was spending time in his bed. And the women of the house, somewhat reluctantly, because they could hardly throw her out into the snow, she'd probably freeze to death before she got to the next village, they agreed. Where else was there in the village where she could stay? Nowhere. And of course, rumour went round the village very, very quickly, as it will in such small communities, and the neighbours found endless, rather spurious excuses to turn up and pay a call on Ivan or one of his sisters or his mother, and obviously get the gossip and clap their eyes upon this mysterious woman and ply her for as much information as they could get out of her, whilst maintaining the front of whatever the official reason for their visit to the house was. Day after day rolled past, and the mystery and the excitement of the visitor began to become a little bit commonplace. Everyone had asked every question they could think of. They'd had the same answers, repeated or variations thereof. And one day leads into another. And this woman proved to be quite a good cook. She proved to be quite useful around the house. And if the mother and the sisters somewhat resented her, they could not deny that, mysterious as she was, strange as she was, erratic as her story of her life seemed to be, she was useful, she was helpful, she was polite. As much as they wanted to find fault with her, it was a struggle to find fault with her. And of course, such is the way of things when a lonely man and a lonely woman, who is in the grief of having lost her husband, get together, spend time together, share food together, sit around the same fire together, contemplate the length of the winter that lays before them and how long it might be, months, before said mysterious woman can go upon her way to find her new life somewhere else. They come to the conclusion, perhaps not unsurprisingly, that maybe her new life could be lived there and found there. And the shy, awkward, somewhat uncertain Ivan began to grow in confidence, began to find that he could talk to this mysterious woman more easily. He could bring back extra food to present not only to his mother and sisters, but to this charming Breda as well, and demonstrate to her that he was a useful sort of man to have around the house, and she could demonstrate to him that she was a useful sort of woman to have around the house. For whilst passion and romance have their role in the world, marriage at the end of the day is a very practical arrangement. Romance only lasts so long, and passion only lasts so long, and you've got to realise that you need to live with people who are useful to have around the house, and they both came to the conclusion that each other was quite useful. And so before spring ever rolled around and travel became easier once again, the two were wed. The sisters put on a brave face of it. The mother put on a brave face of it and bowed to the inevitable, that the son of the house, the brother of the house, would have to find a wife at some point, and as there were no suitable women in the village, clearly it would have to be a woman from somewhere else. And rare as it was to find a woman from somewhere else who was of a suitable age and not otherwise spoken for, here was a suitable woman. Here was a woman not otherwise spoken for. And after the wedding festivities were over and done with, they were too poor to afford an exciting honeymoon, or even to afford a boring honeymoon for that matter. They had their time rolling around in the hay, and their mother and sisters looked in the other direction and plugged their ears and hoped it would all be over quite soon, and the initial enthusiasms of marriage would lead to a somewhat more sedate life. Things began to calm down a little bit into the spring, but it has to be said that during this period of courtship and the early weeks of the marriage, life in the village, I mean, they had the excitement of the wedding itself, everyone gathered together for that, but life in the village was not as dull and routine and repetitive as it had tended to be throughout pretty much the whole of Ivan's life, the whole of his sisters' lives, the whole of his mother's life, and the whole of his father's life when his father was still alive. For during this short period of months, there were more farm animals disappearing than there had been in the previous 30 years. And occasionally a farm animal wandered off into the woods and wasn't seen again. Occasionally some predatory bear or a wolf or whatever came in from the woods and carried off a farm animal, but it was a once in a blue moon occasion. Yet in the space of a very few months, over a dozen animals either vanished completely or were found chewed to pieces. And then it was not simply the farm animals that started to disappear, for not long after the wedding itself, one of the young men on a neighbouring farm was found, or at least bits of him were found, as chewed up as the farm animals had been when they were discovered. And they realised that it was unlikely to be an endless succession of predatory beasts wandering in and taking off farm animals and a farm labourer here and there. It was more likely to be the same beast coming back again and again and again, realising that it had a full larder to choose from. And villagers gathered together, they discussed what they could do about it, they arranged a watch of willing bodies, able bodies to keep an eye on the possible predations of some mysterious beast. It always happened at night. sometimes on a Monday, sometimes a Tuesday, sometimes a Wednesday, at different phases of the moon. There was no consistency beyond the fact that it was at night. And it may be that had she lived a little longer, one of Ivan's sisters, Olga, might have gone on to become the Miss Marple of the village, for it was she who noticed that there was actually a pattern to these deaths of farm animals and the farm hand. It wasn't to do with the days of the week, it wasn't to do with the phases of the moon. The pattern seemed to occur when the mysterious Breda, her sister-in-law, was late coming back from whatever domestic tasks. She'd been off gathering firewood, gathering mushrooms, gathering berries in the woods, finding herbs for treating coughs and colds. There were occasions when any of them might have been off in the woods carrying out tasks, but they'd always hurry back before dark, except Breda, who seemed to have no fear of the dark, no worries about it, and she would, when questioned on it, she would say she had very good eyesight. She had no worries about tripping over hidden roots or banging her head into half-seen branches in the dark. She had no fear of wild animals, so she said, oh, well, they won't bother me, they won't come near me. Why should I worry about these things? It's only uneducated peasants who worry about these things, which went down like a lead balloon with the two sisters and the mother. For although she had not directly called them uneducated peasants, it was fairly obvious what she meant. So she came home, sometimes, late, when the moon was up and darkness was spread across the land. Now she never came back covered in blood or anything as melodramatic as that, but Olga noticed that on those occasions when she came back late, the next day a farm animal would either be declared missing or found mangled and chewed up, or on that occasion a farm hand be found mangled and chewed up. And if Olga mused upon this issue, she mused upon it perhaps a little too loudly for her own good. For the very next night, when Olga went out in daylight to carry out some tasks around the farm, she was late getting back. So late, in fact, she didn't come back at all. And by the time it was dark, and Breda came in carrying a basket full of herbs that she'd gathered in the woods, and was consulted as to had she seen Olga on her travels, and she said, no, not at all. I didn't realise she was still out. It's very unusual for Olga to be out in the dark. In fact, it was unheard of for Olga to be out in the dark. That Ivan, as the man of the house, was sent out with his gun to look for her. And he looked and he looked and he could find her at all. And the next day the neighbours were consulted, for Olga had not come back at all that night. And they looked and eventually they found bits of Olga, blooded and chewed and bitten. And there was a great weeping and sorrow in the house. Ivan was heartbroken, the mother was heartbroken, the sister was heartbroken. Breda, not so much. But, she went along with the family grief as is right and proper, and you can't really expect an in-law to feel the same level of grief as an actual blood relative who's known that person all of their life. And a few weeks went past after the funeral. And it was perhaps that grief weighed heavily on the household. And whilst things had always been a little bit awkward between the new wife and the in-laws. Without Olga around, that awkwardness became more pronounced, and bickering became more bitter and more vindictive, and words that had perhaps once been muttered under breaths now started to be said out loud. And there came a day when the other sister went off to carry out some tasks around the farm during daylight. And the day grew on and on and on, and Breda came back in with a big armful of firewood, and it was dark already, and the mother and Ivan asked, where is the sister? Where is she? And she hadn't seen her, Breda. She knew nothing, and once again Ivan was sent out with his gun to look and found nothing, and once again the next day the neighbours joined in, and after a lot of searching eventually they found bits of the other sister, as chewed up and as bitten up as the first sister. History had repeated, and the mother's heart was so heavy, so full of sorrows, so full of grief. She was carried away into death a week after her last daughter was buried in the soil of Mother Russia, leaving just Ivan and Breda alone. And his heart was sorrowful. He had lost a mother, he had lost two sisters, he'd found a wife, but he'd lost the other three. Breda, not so much. She seemed to quite like living with him by herself. But she began to insist on certain things. Now that there were empty bedrooms in their rather humble house, she said that Ivan should sleep in a separate bed because he snored, and his snoring kept her awake. Whilst Ivan wasn't conscious of snoring, I mean, you were asleep at the time, how would he know? He accepted that perhaps he did, and perhaps it was disruptive for his wife, and they still, every now and then, met for a roll in the hay, but she said no, he should definitely sleep separately. And there were occasions when, as the husband, he started laying down the law, and she said, no, I am not having this. My first husband constantly tried to lay down the law, and I have had enough of it. You must let me do as I choose. I shall cook the food I choose. I shall clean the house the way I choose. I shall look after the farm the way I choose. You must accept it. And she was a good cook. And so Ivan, who always did like a quiet life, eventually stopped laying down the law and accepted that he had to sleep separately, and odd as it all was, he went along with it. Until came the day when Breda went out to gather firewood, and it got later and later and later, and she still hadn't come back, and Ivan thought of his two sisters and of that farmhand, and of the various farm animals around the village that were still disappearing and occasionally turning up half-chewed, and wondered if the fate that had befallen all of them was now going to befall Breda. So he snatched up his gun and he rushed out to find her, and went deeper and deeper into the woods. And there, ahead of him, he heard the crunching of bones, and he crept quietly closer and closer, and wished he had a hunting dog with him, but Breda would have no dogs in the house, nor even outside the house on the farm. Stealthily he peered through the trees towards the sound of the crunching. And there was a wolf, a huge wolf, a white wolf, biting and chewing and crunching upon the bones of some unfortunate sheep that it had lumbered off from one of the farms. And Ivan, as quietly as he could, put his gun to his shoulder and cocked the trigger and aimed the rifle. But perhaps it was the noise of the cocking of the trigger. Perhaps it was that he brushed against a branch or did something to somehow draw the attention of the wolf. For as the rifle was aimed, the wolf looked up and then stood up. And as it stood up on its hind legs, a thing that Ivan had no idea was even possible, the great white fur, the pelt, slid back almost like a coat falling off of its wearer's shoulders. And there he saw the naked form of Breda. He stared in horror at her, she stared in horror at him. And he turned tail and ran back to the house, bewildered, horrified, terrified to realise what his wife was, and he hid under the bed in the house. As he lay there, he thought of not only what she was eating, that sheep, but all of the other sheep and goats and chickens and whatnot that she had eaten. And then he thought of the farmhand, and he thought of his two sisters, and he thought of his poor mother dying of grief. All of this because of Breda. Well, the door of the humble house opened, and Breda, in her human form, walked in. And she soon sniffed him out under the bed and said, "Husband, what do you intend to do?" And Ivan, realising that she wasn't going to eat him, at least not yet anyway, sat and wept and held his head in his hands and said, you have killed my sisters, you have killed so many farm animals. Who else have you killed? And she said, well, just my first husband, nobody else. Your first husband, you killed him? I did. He used to beat me savagely. My parents, he was a rich man, and my parents insisted that I marry him, and I begged and I pleaded to have a different husband, but no, they wanted the money, they wanted the dowries, and they insisted I married him, and he made me miserable beyond belief. And so I gave myself to the wolves in the woods, and I became as a wolf in the woods, and I ripped his throat out. And did you eat him the way you ate my sisters? Asked Ivan. And Breda said, maybe. I had a little nibble as he bled before me. Every blow he had laid upon me, I laid a bite upon him, and watched him die, and tasted of his blood and of his flesh. And Ivan, who had known violent marriages in his own village, had seen women battered by their husbands and husbands battered by their wives, had some sympathy for any woman who wanted to do away with such a brute of a husband. But it was much harder to have sympathy for his poor dead sisters or that poor dead farmhand, or his poor dead mother. But she was his wife, and he did love her. Strange as their relationship was, he did love her. And he said, I think I must go to the priest and ask the priest to carry out an exorcism. If you gave yourself to the wolves, you weren't born this way. You became this way. Perhaps the priest can conduct an exorcism, can do something to banish the evil from you, and you can go back to being normal again, and we can have a normal marriage. And you won't be eating half the village animals or half the villagers. And Breda was not terribly keen on this idea, but she did acknowledge that she had eaten her sister-in-laws and was responsible for the death of her mother-in-law, and that Ivan, who could have just tried to shoot her or something, was trying in his cack-handed way to help her. She said, well, if you wish to speak to the priest, then we will see what the priest says. And so the very next day the priest was brought, confused because Ivan refused categorically to tell the priest what he wanted in case anyone overheard them on the walk, but dragged the priest to the house with his Bible and his thurible and his holy water and all of the other things that Ivan had insisted the priest bring with him. And it was only when they were in the house and the door was shut and barred that he explained to the priest what needed to be done. That Breda was a werewolf. And the priest was at first horrified and then looked at Ivan as if Ivan must be insane. And saying, yeah, there's the grief from the death of your mother, the death of your two sisters, has this unhinged your wits? And Ivan said to his wife, show him. And Breda went and fetched her furs, and she put them on. And at once she was down upon all fours, her face extending into a jaw, a tail protruding from the base of her spine, her elegant hands turning into paws with great claws upon them. And the priest shivered and shook and prayed and howled and sobbed, and eventually Breda took the furs off and stood back up again as a woman. And the priest calmed himself down. And even said to him, do you know a rite for banishing the spirit of the werewolf to turn my poor Breda back into a ordinary woman again? And, well, frankly, the priest didn't, because this was a new one on him, but he knew rituals of exorcism for hauntings and evil spirits and demonic presences. So he lit the candles and the incense, and he began to recite the prayers and pray, and then he took from his bag that the farmer Ivan had insisted he bring with him, he took a great corded scourge. Not a silken scourge for weird kinky sex, but for causing serious damage. And Ivan said, what is it that you do? And the priest said, we must beat the demon out of your wife. We must beat her till the blood runs. Only then will the presence of the wolf spirit leave her. Breda was not impressed by this. And the priest said, we must tie her down so she cannot escape, and we must beat her and beat her and beat her. And then the wolf spirit will go. And he set about dragging Breda to the bedstead and tying her down against her will, and she yelled and she screamed and she tried to reach for her wolf furs, but they were at the other side of the room. And the priest took the whip and lashed her back so hard as to draw blood, and was about to do it a second time when Ivan picked up one of the candlesticks and clubbed him in the back of the head and knocked him senseless to the ground. And he said to his wife, I cannot bear this to go on. He cannot beat you in this way. It's monstrous, it's awful. You've had enough of this from your first husband without having to endure it from that old fool. And he untied her from the bedstead and said, now the priest knows, he will tell everyone. And Breda said, shall I eat him? And her husband said, if you eat the priest. Well, everyone saw the priest coming to the house, saw me dragging him along the streets. They will know that either you have done it or I have done it, if bits of the priest are found all over the place. It's too late for that. You must go. You came here on foot. You must go from here on foot. Run and run and run, and perhaps you will find another new life somewhere else. And he picked up the furs and gave them to her, and she put them on and became a wolf and ran and ran and ran into the forest. And Ivan never saw her again, and what became of her, who can tell? But there ends the story of Ivan of Shiganska. The second contribution to Wolfenoot is a, poem, prayer, spell, incantation, call it what you will. This was collected by an author called Elliot O'Donnell, and there is a lot of debate as to the authenticity of this, in that O'Donnell claimed this to be a traditional Russian prayer. Obviously, I'll give you the English translation because I don't speak Russian. But a lot of Other authors are sceptical that he probably just made it up himself. Who knows? Who knows? But this is meant to be an incantation, a spell to recite to become a werewolf. Maybe this is what Breda herself used to sing. I don't know. But I'll read it for you anyway. Hail, 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 great wolf spirit, hail. A boon I ask thee, mighty shade. Within this circle I have made, make me a werewolf strong and bold, the terror alike of young and old. Grant me a figure tall and spare, the speed of the elk, the claws of the bear, the poison of snakes, the wit of the wolf, of the fox, the stealth of the wolf, the strength of the ox, the jaws of the tiger, the teeth of the shark, the eyes of a cat that sees in the dark. Make me climb like a monkey, scent like a dog, swim like a fish and eat like a hog. Haste, 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 lonely spirit, haste. Here wan and drear magic spell making, findest thou me shaking, quaking, softly fan me as I lie, and thy mystic touch apply. Touch apply, and I swear that when I die, I will serve thee evermore, evermore in grey wolfland cold and raw. Make me a werewolf, make me a man-eater, make me a werewolf, make me a woman-eater, make me a werewolf, make me a child-eater. I pine for blood, human blood, give it me tonight. Great wolf spirit, give it me, and heart, body and soul, I am yours. It's quite nice up until that last verse. Can't see any claws sprouting just yet. Maybe it's because I didn't run around 3 times first, which is what you're meant to do. So yes, could have been a traditional Russian one, or it could be just something that O'Donnell made up as he was going along. Who knows? I don't. But there you go. And the last story to finish this Wolfenoot contribution on comes from a French source, and it's my mangled version, much edited and amended and added to version of a story recorded by Alexandre Dumas, the author famous for the Three Musketeers. In English it's called The Wolf Leader, the Meneur de loups. This is based upon a folk tale which he added to, so this is my version of what that folk tale might originally have been like. Alexandre was an unhappy man. He had worked all his life for the lord of the manor, worked hard since he was 7 years old, and he was now 50 years old, but to look at him you might think he was 70, if not older. He was grey and straggly and thin and haggard from a life of fetching and carrying and drudging in all weathers, being rewarded with bare minimal pay and scant food and scant dress and harsh blows and harsh words whenever he didn't do something quite the way the lord of the manor wanted it done. And there was this day in question, when poor old Alexandre was summoned by the lord of the manor, who had decided to go hunting again. And he wanted his servants around him to go forth and help with the hunting and walk behind the hounds and the horses and pick up the animals that were killed in the hunt and cart them back. And Alexander was getting slow. He wasn't fit and healthy like he'd been as a young man. And the lord of the manor was getting more and more ill-tempered at the slowness of Alexander carrying out the orders and getting in the way of the dogs and getting in the way of the horses, and just being a stumbling, bumbling old fool. And he lashed out with his riding crop and caught Alexander a terrible blow across his face, leaving a great red welt, knocking the poor man down into the dirt and the dust, and told him to bloody well stay there and wait for the hunt's return journey, when he could make himself useful, because he was nothing but a dead weight and getting in the way. And the lord of the manor went off, mumbling and groaning to himself that maybe he should just get rid of the bloody old fool and find somebody new and chuck Alexandra on the scrap heap with all of the other useless old servants. And Alexandra had seen on many an occasion throughout the decades of his life quite what happened to useless old servants who were discarded by the lord of the manor, as many had been, and died starving in the gutter, most of them, and realised that this was what was facing him. And as he sat there tending the great welt on his face and feeling miserable and despairing at a life that seemed to him to have been wasted, he'd never married, he'd never had children, he'd never had any romance to speak of, he had nothing to look forward to in the future, nothing much in the past to look back on except drudgery and drudgery and drudgery. He cried out that he wanted justice, he wanted vengeance, he wanted to put that damned lord of the manor in his place. "Do you indeed?" said a voice. And Alexandra staggered to his feet, his rheumatics aching and groaning, and looked in absolute horror at what stood before him. And at first he thought maybe that blow to his face had knocked the senses from his head, and that he was imagining things, or maybe he was still lying unconscious on the floor and this was all some horrid nightmare going on in his head. But the thing moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell it. And he could think of no dreams he'd ever had in which he could smell things. See them, yes, hear them, yes, but not smell them. And the thing in question was, well, what was it? It was half wolf, but also half man. Like a wolf stood on two legs, but 7 foot tall, and more shaped in the body like a man, but in the head a wolf. In the hands were well, somewhere between the hands of a man and the hands of a wolf, with great talons upon them and hair all over the knuckles, and a tail swishing at the back. It was neither one thing nor another, but a mixture of both. And Alexandra, smelling that powerful lupine odour as it got closer, and seeing its breath cloud upon the air, and the saliva dripping from that great lolling tongue as the wolf spoke to him. So, what do you want? More importantly, said the creature, what do you want? You call for justice. You call for vengeance. Many times in your life, Alexandra, you have cried out and received nothing. No justice, no vengeance. You call to the Virgin, you call to the saints, you call to the Saviour, you call to God, but none of your prayers have ever been answered, have they, Alexandra? No, admitted the old servant, never. But who are you? I am the master of the forest. I am the one who comes to answer your imprecations. For your lord of the manor, he is off hunting, and in his mind he wants to hunt wolves that he may bring back pelts to make himself robes decorated with wolf fur. And this does not please me. And Alexander shook and shivered and thought of running away, but he was old and doddery, and his legs did not carry him as fast as they once had. And looking at this great gigantic wolf man before him, he knew he couldn't possibly outrun the creature. How may I get vengeance? How may you grant me vengeance? Well, my little man, I will make 2 gifts to you, and in return you will serve me. And the creature held out one enormous taloned paw hand, and in it was a strip of wolf skin, like a belt. And the creature said, "Tie this around your waist like a girdle, and it will grant you strength and health and vigor. You will be as lusty and healthy and hungry as a wolf in the forest." And this, he held out his other hand paw and presented a flute, a simple wooden flute. "This you may play." I've never played a flute before," said Alexander. "Does not matter. Merely blow upon it and the flute will play itself. It knows the tunes, and you will become my Meneur de loups, my musician of the wolves, for the wolves of the forest will hear you playing, and they will come to listen to your music and serve your will. Remember, Alexander, every time you call upon me for help in avenging yourself, your hair will change." The old man raised a hand to his head and felt what very little white hairs he had left upon his scalp. How do I call upon you?" "Blow upon the flute and say what you want. Blow now upon the flute and tell me once more that you want vengeance upon the Lord of the Meneur." The old man picked up the flute and put it to his lips and blew, and he had never blown a flute before in his life, but at once his fingers began to move as if they had a life of their own, and his lips began to blow in a way that if they too had a life of their own, and a music emerged from the flute, a music he had never in his life heard before, haunting and magical and wonderful and disturbing and mysterious, and it carried across the forest. And at once there was howling from the east and howling from the west, howling from the north and howling from the south, as the wolves of the wood heard the music, and they sang and they sang and they sang. And finally his lips stopped blowing as if of their own accord, and his fingers stopped moving as if of their own accord, and he lowered the flute shaking with bewilderment at the power of the musical instrument, and he said, I want, and his fingers stroked the welt upon his face left by the Lord of the Manor's riding crop. I want that man to suffer as he has made me suffer. And the great creature bowed its shaggy head and stared him eye to eye, great yellowing eyes holding Alexandra's own eyes, and said, "It shall be my pleasure." And with that it took tail and ran upon four legs into the forest and disappeared, leaving Alexandra sitting there in the dirt, holding the flute with the wolfskin girdle tied about his waist, wondering if he were going insane. Was that the devil? Was it something older or stranger than the devil? He did not know. And he felt a heat in his head, and a scratching and itching. As he pulled his fingers away, a lock of hair was there, growing from his head, as red could be. Just the one lock. When he looked at the other bits of hair, it was still silvery white, but a red lock. What the Irish used to call the coolan, the wolf lock. And Alexandra waited and waited and waited, and an hour and a half, 2 hours went past, and then he heard the galloping of hooves and the blowing of hunting horns, and the barking of the hunting hounds, and the hunting party came back, the other servants, the other aristocrats that had gone out hunting with the Lord of the Manor as his guests. And there was the Lord of the Manor's great black horse being led at a sedate pace by one of the other servants with no one upon its back. And there behind the horse came 4 of the larger, younger servants, the big lads, carrying a stretcher between them, a makeshift stretcher, for they had taken nothing of the kind out with them, but 2 great long thick branches and some material. He didn't pay close attention to what it was, stretched between them, and lying upon that material, lying upon that makeshift stretcher, he saw the recumbent form of the Lord of the Manor, no longer wielding a riding crop, blood upon his chest, blood upon his arms, groaning and moaning, and Alexandra fell in with the procession as it returned its sombre journey to the castle, and inquired of one of the other servants what on earth had happened, and the servant, filled with the excitement of gossip, told him that they'd got deeper and deeper and deeper into the woods, hunting different creatures. They'd caught deer, they'd caught boar, and then they'd got scent of wolves, and they'd gone after the wolves, for the Lord of the Manor took a fancy to have a wolfskin cape. But just as the Lord's great black stallion had burst through the glade after these wolves, 3 wolves had leapt out from nowhere and gone for the horse, and the horse had reared up and thrown the Lord of the Manor from its back, and as he crashed onto the forest floor, and before the hounds, before the servants, before the other huntsmen, before anyone had had a chance to do a damn thing, they're just looking on in horror, seemingly 24 wolves had emerged from left and right, from east and west and north and south, had come from everywhere and descended upon the Lord of the Manor as he lay there, biting and nipping and ripping and tearing. And when the hunting hounds had tried to intervene, 12 of them had been killed outright and others were injured. And when the servants had tried to intervene, they had been snapped at and bitten at, and the other aristocratic hunters that had been riding as guests of the Lord, well, they were all too self-interested in personal preservation to risk their lives in trying to rescue the host who had invited them upon this journey. But then, said the gossiping servant, as of nothing, we heard this music from somewhere, far off, and suddenly the wolves were gone, howling as they went, but they were gone. And there we saw the Lord of the Manor, lying as you see him now in this blooded heap, missing fingers, missing toes, missing an ear, missing great lumps of him gouted out. we made a stretcher, and we carried him back, as you see him there now. Others have run on ahead to fetch for physician, and we fear he will not last. I mean, look at the state of him. Wow. All of this gossiping took the remainder of the journey back to the manor. And Alexander did not see the lord of the manor again, for he was taken off to his bedchamber. The doctors were sent for, they did what they could, and as everyone in the castle knew full well from all of the instructions carried out of the sick room, the lord of the manor lingered 7 days and 7 nights in constant agony, bleeding and suppurating, and doctors doing everything they could think of to do, and even more expensive doctors being sent for from even further away, coming and doing what little they could do, and little it was, because after 7 days of constant pain, the man died and was buried. And if anyone noticed the fact that old Alexander, amongst his Spartan white hairs on his head, now had a lock of red hair, well, there was far too many other interesting things going on with the dying of the lord of the manor for anyone to pass comment on some boring old servant. And if anyone noticed that he was moving with a more sprightly step these days, and was able to fetch and carry more energetically than he had been able to do for donkey's years, again, there were far too many other important things going on for anyone to much care about that. And of course, once the lord of the manor was dead and interred, then there were questions of inheritances going back and forth. And there was, some months down the line, a new lord of the manor to take the place of the old one. A nephew of the previous lord of the manor who, well, he had had children, but none of them had lived to adulthood, and so there were no direct blood heirs to inherit the manor, and instead it had gone to one of the nephews, and there had been arguments and wrangling around which nephew, and searching for wills and inheritances, and all of the usual palaver that happens when the rich die and the vultures gather. And if anyone had hoped that the new lord of the manor would be better tempered and kinder and wiser and less bibulous than the previous one, then frankly they had hoped in vain. And the new lord had been installed but a week when it became blatantly obvious that he was just as verbally abusive, just as heavy-handed, with the riding crop or a fist or whatever on earth came to hand to lob at some servant who wasn't moving fast enough and quickly enough or efficiently enough, as the previous incumbent, his uncle, had been. Like uncle, like nephew. And it wasn't long before Alexander himself became a victim of this new lord's ill temper, when a flying jug caught him in the back of the head because he hadn't done something in quite the way that the lord of the manor expected it to be done. And yet again there were threats of throwing the old fool out of the castle and getting someone new in to do the job for half the money. And Alexandra went off muttering and snarling to himself and cursing fate that seems to present opportunities to get rid of the wicked only to replace them with somebody just as wicked. What is the good of a revolution if you just get rid of one tyrant and end up with another? And then he remembered the flute and the girdle of wolfskin that he wore always underneath his shirt where nobody else would see it. And when his tasks were done for the day, his duties were done for the day, he slipped out of the castle, telling everyone he just wanted a little walk to help relax him before bedtime. And he wandered off to a darkened corner of the manorial estate, away from the prying eyes of other servants. And he produced his flute, and he began to play and play and play, or maybe I should say, it was as if the flute began to play itself, because even though he was no more learned in music on this day than he was on that first day, his fingers began to move with a life of their own, and his lips began to blow with a rhythm of their own, and the music, the same music he had played before, began to echo and echo and echo around and around and around the glade. And from the east and the west and the north and the south, the howling of wolves came and came and came. And not just the howling of wolves, but, as he noticed, somewhat alarmed as his fingers were doing their thing, a wolf appeared from one shadow, and then a wolf from another, and a wolf from another, and a wolf from another. Wolf after wolf after wolf appeared, until the Meneur des loups was sitting there, surrounded by wolves, an audience of appreciative lupines sitting and listening to their new favourite musician, swaying in tune to the music, tails wagging in tune to the music, tongues lolling in tune to the music, until at last the music stopped of its own accord, and his fingers fell still, and his lips stopped to blow. And he wondered what he should do. Would these wolves leap upon him and eat him now that the music was over and done with? But no, they did not. They sat there as obedient as the most well-trained pack of dogs. And some of them even came up to him and nuzzled him and put their heads in his lap, and he didn't know what else to do except to treat them like he would treat a dog, and he stroked their heads and stroked their ears and actually found himself quite liking the experience. Once his initial terror was overcome, they were really quite like just very big dogs. Some of them were even rolling on their backs with their paws in the air for a belly rub. He did that for a good half an hour, until one of the wolves looked at him and said, "Is there anything you require, master?" And the belly rub stopped, and old Alexandra sat back on his haunches and was quite surprised by a talking wolf, although he had already met the half-man, half-wolf talking creature many months earlier. But here was a talking wolf, and he wondered, was this the same creature, maybe just turned into a full wolf rather than a half-wolf? He didn't know. And he said, after some minutes, when he'd recovered from the shock, "The new lord of the manor is as much a tyrant and as much a monster as the old one. What a tragedy it would be if he were to go the same way as the old one." And the wolf threw back its head and howled, and every other wolf gathered around, threw back its head and howled. And amongst all of the howling, old Alexandra heard a voice, and the voice, a human voice, said, "Dear God, what is it?" And looking over by the light of the moon, old Alexandra saw a figure, a human figure, running in panic. He didn't know who it was, but a figure running in panic. And the wolves dispersed. East and west and north and south, they dispersed. And Alexander walked back to his bed. And in the morning, when he was shaving and tending to himself, he noticed that amongst the not quite as Spartan as they used to be white hairs upon his head, for he was sure that he had more hair now than he had 3 years ago. Not a full head of hair, but more hair. He noticed there was a second lock of red, gingery hair. So much so, in fact, that other servants began to notice. Did you always have red hair?" they asked at breakfast. And one of the very elderly servants said, well, when you were young, you were dark-haired, weren't you? Why on earth are you dyeing your hair red now? And Alexandra mumbled and stumbled into his beard and said something. Nobody paid much attention to it anyway. They just rolled their eyes and thought, what a silly old fool dyeing his hair red. And if some of them noticed that the silly old fool didn't look quite as old as he used to, he didn't have quite as many bags under his eyes, his cheeks were not quite as sunken as they used to be, he wasn't as stooped as he used to be. In fact, he was standing quite upright when he walked about, as well as being more agile and fitter and stronger for picking and fetching and carrying and dealing with heavy boxes and the things that he was asked to fetch and carry. Well, if they noticed it, they didn't think it important enough to gossip upon, but they noticed it. And that day orders were given by the new lord of the manor that, rather like his late and unlamented uncle, he fancied a day of hunting. And so the men were gathered, the fit young ones who could keep up with the dogs and keep up with the horses, and Alexander, no one bothered to ask him, because in their mind he was just some doddery old fool, so why would they want him to take part in the hunt? They all rode out. The lord of the manor, no guests this time, just a whim of his own. There was no one to invite to join him, so off he went with his servants into the woods. And a similar thing happened that happened to his uncle. A few hours later, as Alexander was pottering around carrying out various menial tasks, there came the sounding of hunting horns, there came the barking of dogs, and Alexander looked out of a window and saw the new horse, not the old black stallion that belonged to the uncle, but the new horse the new lord of the manor had brought with him, was being led back riderless, and once again there was a stretcher borne amongst them. And once again, when they arrived at the great manor, the new lord of the manor was taken up to his bedroom, and doctors were sent for, and the gossip went round and round and round the kitchens, and all of the other servants gathered throughout the manor. Old Alexandra heard that history had repeated itself. They'd got into the depths of the woods, they'd caught a few deer, they'd caught a few wild boar, and then the wolves had appeared from nowhere, and the lord of the manor had been thrown, and then he had been set upon the way his uncle had been set upon, and then, just as previous, the wolves had upped and disappeared at a moment's notice, leaving a half-chewed, half-mangled lord of the manor behind them. And he had been carried back, and the same doctors as last time were sent for. And this time, instead of lasting 7 days the way his benighted uncle had lasted, this one lasted 9 days in constant pain and agony, before he too succumbed to his wounds. But throughout the time of the dying of the second lord of the manor, the local priest had been in and out, carrying out his priestly duties, as was to be expected with a lord of the manor who appeared to be on his last legs, praying for healing and curing, which obviously never came. But he had also been talking and gossiping to those of his social station, but overheard by the servants of the castle, talking about a terrifying experience that he had had when he had been walking late one night across the edges of the manorial estates on the way from the church back to his home, that he had seen a mysterious figure playing music to a great throng of wolves. It seemed to him, the priest, that this was demonic, this was unnatural. I mean, who on earth can charm wolves with music? But the priest had heard stories from his own childhood that there were people who could do these things, that had these mysterious powers, people who had made alliances with the devil, people who were in league with unholy forces, and perhaps it seemed to him, the priest, that the death of the previous lord of the manor and the desperate injuring, as it was at that point in time, of this current lord of the manor might not be mere accidents and the freakish behaviour of the wolves, gathering in the way they did, attacking in the way they did, dispersing in the way they did, could be accounted for perhaps if there were indeed magic at the root of this, some kind of witchcraft, some kind of unholiness. And the priest began to say perhaps they should call for, the bishop, perhaps they should call for the cardinal, perhaps they should ask somebody from the Holy Office itself to come, one of the inquisitors, to investigate who amongst the local population. For the priest, when he had seen this figure, had not seen the figure close enough in the dark, in the moonlight, to be able to tell precisely who it was. It was just the general outline of a tall and manly shape playing music to the wolves. But there might be many men who could fit that description. They should have a proper investigation. They should put it to the test to find out who it might be. Well, when old Alexandra heard this account of what the priest was saying, he realised it was probably a matter of time before the priest would not only do what he promised to do, but he'd whip up his congregation into such a state of panic that they would all be demanding and pleading with the priest he should absolutely go and talk to the bishop, talk to the cardinal, talk to an inquisitor, talk to somebody somewhere. For if there was witchcraft, if there was magic, if there were unholy alliances taking place with somebody or another in their community between him and the wolves, then something would have to be done. And of course they might not realise it was Alexandra, they might think it was somebody else, but it would not be a pleasant time for anybody if the Inquisition arrived, if some inquiry took place. And he thought about what he should do. Should he just pack his bags and flee? Should he hold out and hope they just didn't realise it was him, but then they might think it was some other poor soul and put them to the Inquisition, put them to the tortures and end up burning them at the stake or doing something equally horrible to them? And did he want that on his conscience, the death of some other poor benighted creature no better off in life than he was? And then he started to wonder if the gossips in the servants' hall who had noticed his unusual red locks would repeat that story, because of course whenever people start looking around for witches and wizards and whatnot, they look for unusual signs. Alexandra was old enough to have remembered occasions in the past when some panic would go around the local townspeople and they'd convince themselves that some toothless old woman was actually a witch and that her peculiar warts were a sign of her being in league with the devil, and she'd end up being ducked, she'd end up being lynched, she'd end up being burnt, something dreadful would be done to them, all because of some minor physical peculiarities. Surely, it seemed to him it was quite likely that somebody sooner or later would twig the oddity of his appearance, and on one occasion he tried cutting the red locks off, but by the very next morning they had regrown and were just as long. What should he do? What should he do? And whilst he was thinking of what should he do, the priest was busy putting into action all of the things he had spoken about. He went to the bishop went to the cardinal went to the inquisitors. The inquisitors arrived, and they began interrogating people. They listened to the priest's story. They started asking awkward questions of any tall man in the community, anyone who might be held to have a grudge against the current or the previous lord of the manor. And by that time the current lord of the manor finally met his end. And the inquisitors attended the funeral as everybody else attended the funeral. And Alexandra stood at the back with all of the other servants in the church. and he felt the eyes of the other servants upon him. He heard the occasional comment, not so much in the church, but comments that had been made that morning, that he looked fitter than he had looked for some while. He wasn't as wrinkly as he had looked for some considerable time. He was looking healthier, he wasn't as stooped, his hands were not as gnarled, his rheumatism seemed to be improving. Odd little passing transitory comments here and there that meant nothing in and of themselves, except that he kept thinking, as soon as the inquisitors start asking questions of the servants, someone somewhere is bound to mention the oddities of old Alexander and how he has changed. And if they're looking for someone to blame, might they not blame me? The funeral was held, it was finished, the body was interred. The servants had their many duties to do whilst the castle was untenanted, and debates were being had as to who would inherit from the very, very short-lived lord of the manor. And that night Alexandra went out into the grounds once again, but very, very cautiously, worried about eyes everywhere, twitching curtains, people noticing he went out into the woods, to the edges of the woods at the edges of the estate, where estate met forest, and he sat upon a stump. He took out the flute. He thought about throwing it away. He felt underneath his shirt for the wolfskin girdle, and he thought about taking it off and throwing it away. But he did love to feel healthy again, to feel energetic again, to feel the stirrings of passions he could barely remember having had in the first place again. And he didn't want to throw it away, and he thought of that night when the wolves had gathered and listened to him, humble Alexandra, that nobody had ever listened to, that nobody had ever paid attention to, that nobody had ever given a damn about. And there he was commanding a pack of wolves, possessed of a magic that these silly peasants could barely dream of and imagine, that even these lords of the manor, these aristocrats, these priests and bishops and cardinals and inquisitors could barely imagine. He, Alexandra, had, however, inadvertently become something special. He who had never once been special. And he didn't want to throw it away. And he wondered how far the power of the wolves could extend. And almost without realizing he was doing it, he lifted the flute to his lips, and these fingers began to take a life of their own, and his lips took a life of their own. And the music carried and carried and carried, and people in the manor house and people in the inns in the town where the inquisitors were being put up heard the music, and some of them shook with terror, and some of them reached for their cloaks to go and find the source of the music. It played and it played, and then from the east and the west and the north and the south, the howling of the wolves echoed across the forest. And the people in the towns and the people in the manor house, well, most of them hid under their beds for terror, but some brave souls, determined souls, you might say even fanatical souls, decided that this was the right time to track down the miscreants, catch them in the act, save themselves a lot of fuss and bother interrogating the wrong people, and go direct to the source of this wickedness, this evil. They set out into the night armed with guns, armed with swords and with axes and with crucifixes and with holy water and anything else they could lay hands to that seemed appropriate. And whilst they were gathering and leaving their houses, these determined few, the many of the forest, the children of the night, came and gathered around Alexandra, the wolves sitting with their lolling tongues and their wagging tails themselves in tune to the music, getting closer and closer to him, laying their heads upon his lap that he might stroke their heads and fondle their ears, and he playing and playing and playing and playing. Until at length the music stopped of its own accord, and in the distance he heard the shouting and yelling of the brave few, hunting the source of the music. And one of the wolves said, "What do you want of us? What do you want of us, O master of the forest? The Meneur, the loups, what do you want of us?" And Alexandra said, "The inquisitors come. Take them. Take them away from here. And take me away from here. Take me away from here." And at once the wolves went from him, howling and snapping and calling and crying, some to the left, some to the right, some to the east, some to the north, some to the west, some to the south. And the inquisitors and their assistants, their men, the brave few who had gathered with their weapons, they heard the howling and snapping of wolves from the west and wolves from the east and wolves from the south and wolves from the north, coming in the dark around and around and around. And they fired their guns, they swished their swords, they wielded their axes, but they were wielding them in darkness against barely seen opponents, felt opponents, as fangs sank into hands or into thighs and dragged bodies down and sank into throats and sank into stomachs, and there were screams of pain and of terror and gurgles of blood and the crunching of bones. And some of the wolves died with the swords and with the axes and with the bullets, but there were far more wolves than there were inquisitors. And within the end of an hour there were no inquisitors, no hardy souls left, bits of them, but none alive. And Alexandre sat still upon his stump, listening to the screams of terror and of pain and of death. And had there been enough light for him to see, he would have found another red lock upon his head. And he looked at his hands in the moonlight, and they seemed to him the hands of a young man, not a haggard old one. And he stood tall and proud and straight-backed. And he heard footsteps, or maybe I should say poor steps, coming closer and closer. And he smelt the aroma of the man-wolf. And whilst the very first time he smelled it, it was disgusting to him then, now it seemed to him wonderful. Better than the smell of any of the humans he knew. And the man-wolf laid a great clawed hand-paw upon his shoulder, and Alexandre began to shift and turn, and where there was a servant beforehand, now there was a pile of clothes, and stood next to them a great red-pelted wolf. And when the wolf man threw back his head and howled, all of the wolves of the forest, who had finished eating and devouring the inquisitors, came running to his heels, and he led the pack now including the wolf that had once been Alexandre, into the forest, and they ran, and they ran, and they run still.